It was 1220, and travelers navigating the ancient trade routes of Central Asia were horrified by the sight that met them. In place of the city of Merv, MV, once famous for its libraries, markets, and cultural vibrancy, there was now only scorched earth and a suffocating silence. Faded bones lay under the sun, a silent monument to a civilization's proud past, the memory of a culture obliterated by a single destructive act of human hubris. We are journeying into the shadows of history. We will discover forgotten stories together. Like and share where you are watching from in the comments. The Khwarezmian Empire once controlled the world's most valuable trade routes, with its vast territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. Its rulers saw themselves as the heirs of Alexander the Great and the masters of an empire of millions. But in the brief span of 3 years, this magnificent empire suffered such a profound devastation that subsequent generations would struggle to believe it ever truly existed. It all started with a trade caravan. It would all end with the death of a civilization. And at the epicenter of this catastrophe stood Genghis Khan, who redefined the limits of total war with his response. The world was on the brink of an abyss. The year was 1218. At that time, the world still seemed vast enough for multiple empires to coexist. Goods, ideas, and cultures flowed like rivers from east to west. Silk, spices, mathematics, philosophy. Trade was at its peak, and borders were perceived not as barriers, but as meeting points. To the elites of Europe and Asia, the Mongol Empire was merely a distant tribe, exotic but not serious, not posing a threat. It could not possibly rival established empires like the Khwarezmian. But civilizations are more fragile than they appear. Their collapse does not always come from years of internal decay. Sometimes a single fatal mistake is enough. Sometimes the real danger is not the barbarian at the gates, but the absolute power that chooses to annihilate rather than forgive. The Khwarezmian Empire was not just a kingdom, but the brightest crown of Islamic civilization in Central Asia. It encompassed territories of present-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, parts of Afghanistan, and Kazakhstan. The empire dazzled with its wealth, sophistication, and power. It was ruled by Sultan Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, who reigned from 1200 to 1220. His dominion included the world's most important cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench. His people controlled the legendary Silk Road, making the empire an economic powerhouse. Gold, jewelry, ivory, and silk flowed into its cities, and wealth flourished in the streets. But beneath this splendor, one misstep could shatter the entire order. And this was precisely the harbinger of the catastrophe that would change the course of history. The Khwarezmians' armies left an almost legendary impression of strength. Composed of hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers, armored cavalry, master archers, and siege engineers, this army presented a unity that made facing it nearly impossible. Their cities were surrounded by walls so thick and high they could withstand centuries of siege. Conquering neighboring kingdoms seemed almost child's play. Culturally, they were at their peak. Libraries were filled with manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and many other fields. Scholars from all corners of the Islamic world came to study there, almost on pilgrimage. Palaces glittered with artists, poets, and philosophers, shining with prestige. The Khwarezmians viewed themselves as the rightful heirs of the great Persian empires. In their eyes, the Mongols were merely nomadic warriors, without cities, without heritage, and devoid of culture. It was this contempt that became the first spark of the error that would determine the fate of the empire. Geopolitically, the Khwarezmians thought they held all the advantages. They had defeated the Karakitai and seized their lands. Thus, they became direct neighbors to the rising Mongol power in the east. But Sultan Muhammad saw this proximity not as a reason for caution, but as an opportunity. He believed the Mongols could be either good trading partners or be reduced to obedient vassals. The moment his arrogance peaked was when he openly questioned the spiritual authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and declared himself a ruler chosen by God. He called himself the Second Alexander and thought it was his destiny to rule the entire known world. This overconfidence was the beginning of a blinding and unshakable delusion. In the spring of 1218, a trade caravan approached the border city of Otrar. This was no ordinary group of merchants. It was a carefully selected diplomatic mission, personally sanctioned by Genghis Khan. There were approximately 450 people, mostly Muslim merchants, but also Mongol representatives and possibly intelligence officers. They carried loads worth of fortune, including gold, silk, jade, furs, and ivory. But most importantly, this was a message. The Mongols had come in peace, offering partnership through trade. Genghis Khan had entrusted the mission to Muslim merchants, knowing that religious kinship would facilitate relations. All signs on the caravan indicated a peaceful intention. Everything was prepared for diplomacy. But the governor of Otrar, Inalchuq, the Sultan's uncle, interpreted the situation entirely differently. Otrar was a strategically important border post, and Inalchuq was a governor who was both paranoid and greedy. He accused the caravan of spying. Whether this was true is unknown, but what followed was certainly criminal. With the Sultan's implicit permission, Inalchuq ordered the arrest of the entire caravan. Thus, 450 men lost their lives. Their bodies were left outside the city like garbage. Their goods were looted and divided among the governor's men. The only survivor was a camel driver, who carried the news of the massacre to the Mongol court. This single act upended all balances. Because at the time, especially merchants carrying a royal seal were considered sacred. Killing an envoy was an attack on peaceful diplomacy. Annihilating all of them was an outright declaration of war. The Khwarezmians were oblivious to the gravity of their actions. When this news reached the capital in Karakorum, Genghis Khan did not immediately react with anger. According to the Persian historian Javani, he went up a hill and sat alone for 3 days and 3 nights, contemplating what to do. When he descended, his decision was made. The Khwarezmian Empire would be erased. But first, he made one last attempt at diplomacy. He sent 3 envoys to Sultan Muhammad, 1 Muslim, 2 Mongols. Their message was clear: return the stolen goods, surrender Governor Inalchuq, and accept responsibility. If you do this, the matter will be closed. The Sultan's response was mocking and humiliating. He had the Muslim envoy executed and the beards of the Mongol envoys shaved off. In Mongol culture, this was an extremely grave insult. When the 2 mutilated envoys returned to the court, the entire leadership was horrified. Some wept in fury. Others immediately demanded revenge. Genghis Khan rose and said calmly but firmly, "The Sultan has chosen war. Then let there be war." This was no longer a political dispute. It was a matter of honor. According to Mongol law, there were 2 options: total surrender or total annihilation. The Sultan had chosen annihilation. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire still stood proud, unaware that it had sealed its own doom. There was activity in their cities, self-confidence in their armies, but no one could have guessed that the power facing them was one that the Middle Ages had never seen before. Genghis Khan had already prepared. He amassed an army of 100,000 to 150,000 warriors. These were not just swordsmen on horseback. They were a force shaped by years of experience, discipline, and ruthless warfare. Every soldier was equipped with multiple horses, allowing them to advance with incredible speed and endurance. They carried their own provisions, lived off the land, and never waited for supply wagons. But what truly set them apart was the technology they brought with them. Chinese siege engineers, advanced trebuchets, and early gunpowder weapons. The Mongols were not only fast-moving, but also possessed a flexible and deadly siege capability. They could target even the most fortified cities, and their target was now Otrar. Otrar, the city that had triggered Genghis Khan's fury, was chosen as the first target. The city stood behind its high walls, its defenders believing they could withstand any siege. The Mongols advanced under the leadership of Governor Inalchuq, the man responsible for the massacre at Otrar. However, the command on the scene was personally held by Genghis Khan. This was no ordinary siege. From the beginning, The Mongols not only applied force, but also spread terror. They confused the defenders through spies and defectors, and used local inhabitants as human shields. Step by step, with cold-blooded strategy, the siege was tightened. 5 months of brutal resistance only delayed the inevitable disaster. When the city fell, the end was swift and ruthless. Inalchuq was captured alive, and according to historians, his punishment was symbolic. Molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears. The remaining 100,000 inhabitants were massacred. The city was razed to the ground. But this horrific destruction was only the beginning. The fire spread. The target was Bukhara. With the ashes of Otrar barely settled, the Mongol army marched into the heart of the Khwarezmians. Bukhara was one of the pearls of Islamic civilization, a center of learning, trade, and culture for centuries. Its libraries were filled with treasures of knowledge. Its markets attracted merchants from all corners of the known world. The Khwarezmians had fortified the city and positioned their armies at strategic points. But Genghis Khan did not take the expected route. He directed his army through the difficult Kizilkum Desert. The defenders felt as though the Mongols had appeared out of thin air, and panic spread quickly. The garrison, mostly Turkish soldiers, attempted an early sortie. The Mongols executed a feigned retreat, trapped them, and annihilated them in the open field. The defense collapsed, and Bukhara opened its gates. The leaders hoped for negotiation. They expected only tribute and perhaps the execution of a few officials. What they received was Mongol justice in its totality. Genghis Khan entered the city and delivered a harsh and unforgettable speech to its people. Everyone would pay the price for their sultan's arrogance. Soldiers were executed, civilians were separated. Artisans were taken east as slaves. Young men were conscripted into the Mongol army, and the rest were killed or enslaved. The destruction was systematic. Treasures were looted, libraries were burned, the great mosque was turned into a stable, and families were torn apart. This was not chaos, but planned, calculated demolition. The Mongols destroyed what they did not need and preserved only what was useful. Bukhara became a ghost city within days. The next target was Samarkand. If Bukhara was a prize, Samarkand was the crown. The heart of the Khwarezmian Empire, with its magnificent architecture, wealth, and cultural prestige, had a defense force of about 50,000. Thanks to the intelligence gathered by Genghis Khan, he knew which gates were weak and swayed local leaders. The siege lasted 5 days. The defenders tried the same tactic as in Bukhara. The Mongols pulled the same trick, a feigned retreat followed by slaughter. 8 armies sent by Sultan Muhammad II were repelled, and Samarkand surrendered. But Genghis Khan was now even more ruthless. Even the surrendering soldiers of the resistance were executed. Civilians were separated. Artisans to Mongolia, young men to war. The rest faced death or exile. Treasures were removed, the city was ruined, and families were annihilated. The speed instilled fear across the entire empire. One of the world's greatest cities had fallen in less than a week. Sultan Muhammad II fled, his armies dispersed, his cities destroyed, and his people killed in the thousands. But the Mongols were not yet finished. Subutai and Jebe, with 20,000 elite soldiers, were sent to hunt down the Sultan and completely destroy him. During this pursuit, which spanned thousands of kilometers, the Mongol generals instilled fear everywhere they went: cooperate or suffer the fate of Samarkand and Bukhara. All cities surrendered except for a small island. Genghis Khan's rage was focused on completely cleansing the empire. In December 1220, Muhammad II reached a small island in the Caspian Sea. Sick, disoriented, and regretful, he died, probably of pneumonia, according to some, of a broken heart. The man who had defied Genghis Khan died nameless, exiled, and alone. But the Mongols were just getting started. With the death of Sultan Muhammad II, the Khwarezmian Empire no longer had a central command mechanism. There was no leader, no vision, and no hope. All that remained were isolated cities. Some clung to dreams of resistance. Others naively hoped the worst was over. But Genghis Khan's campaign was not yet finished. The goal was no longer just conquest. Annihilation was the purpose. After Muhammad's death, the Mongol forces spread into the remaining regions of the empire. Their mission was clear: destroy every remaining fortress and make an example of every resisting city. Some cities chose to surrender immediately. Merv, Nishapur, Herat, and Urgench opened their gates, hoping that cooperation would save them. But this time, the scale was completely different. The word mercy had been discarded. In February 1221, the city of Merv, the pearl of the world, surrendered without resistance. The people believed that surrender would save them, but this was a delusion. The Mongol army swept into the city and initiated a massacre that operated with almost systematic, mechanical precision. Persian chroniclers would later record that over 1 million people were killed. The number was likely exaggerated. What was important was the method: a cold-blooded, orderly, and merciless annihilation. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota: 300, sometimes 400 civilians. The massacre lasted for days. When it was over, the streets were stained red, safe haven was gone, and sacred sites were desecrated. Merv was erased from the map. No longer a city, just a history lesson. The next target was Nishapur, and the vengeance here was even more brutal. During the siege, a Mongol prince, the son-in-law of Genghis Khan, was killed by an arrow fired from the city. This death enraged the Khan's daughter. She demanded and received revenge. After the city surrendered, she ordered the death of everyone living: men, women, children, and animals, all of them. Even cats and dogs were slaughtered. Nishapur, once the hometown of the poet Omar Khayyam, was turned into a ruin filled with bones. Urgench was the last fortress of the Khwarezmian Empire. Situated along the Amu Darya River, it was naturally protected by water and well defended. However, it also carried symbolic importance. The destruction of Urgench would extinguish the last spark of Khwarezmian power. The siege lasted 6 months, a rarely encountered serious resistance for the Mongols. The defenders fought to the end, knowing that surrender would not guarantee safety. Finally, Genghis Khan intervened personally. He diverted the course of the river, and the city fell. The Mongols ensured that Urgench would never rise again. By the end of 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was no more. A civilization had been completely erased. This campaign was different from others because it was comprehensive and systematic. The Mongols did not just defeat the Khwarezmians militarily. They annihilated them. Their cities, their libraries, their scholars, all of it. This was not an occupation, but a literal obliteration. The population disappeared. Centers of culture and learning were destroyed within weeks, and the Silk Road was covered in ashes and skulls. The Persian chronicler Javani described it as one of the most horrific tragedies ever seen in history. And the interesting thing is that almost everything we know about the Khwarezmians today comes from the records of those who destroyed them. Their own voices were silenced. The Islamic world was shaken. The Khwarezmian Empire was not just a political power, but a cultural bridge. Manuscripts preserved for centuries were burned, scholars were killed or enslaved, intellectual traditions were cut short, and the demographic impact was enormous. To state it in numerical terms, approximately 90% of the region's population may have been wiped out, though the true figures are almost impossible to verify. Cities turned into silent, deserted ghost towns. Irrigation canals collapsed, and fertile lands were reclaimed by the wilderness. Interestingly, the Mongols did not destroy trade. On the contrary, they rebuilt the Silk Road under their own control, seizing economic power over the region. In time, the power that burned the Khwarezmian markets itself became a new economic empire, establishing a vast trade network extending from China to Europe. This is one of the most ironic points in history. The power that swept away a civilization could also revive the very routes that enriched it. The definition of war had completely changed with this campaign. Genghis Khan did not just win a victory, he rewrote the rules. War was no longer about just land or tribute. It meant total annihilation, total war. There was no mercy, no rebuilding, only the complete elimination of the enemy's capacity to exist. This was a warning that would echo through the centuries. No empire, no matter how powerful or advanced, that underestimates its enemies can escape destruction. By 1221, the great Khwarezmian cities like Merv, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench were reduced to ruins. The streets were silent, the people gone, and the culture remained only in memory. This empire, which once defied the caliph and declared itself the heir of Alexander the Great, was turned to dust in less than 3 years. The reason was not its weakness. The hubris and pride of its leaders led them to ruin. Sultan Muhammad II, by killing the envoys, humiliated a potential ally and faced a power whose magnitude he could not grasp. This was the beginning of the price that annihilated his entire people. And the lesson was clear: civilization is fragile, power is temporary. The ruins of Merv, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench still whisper that warning. The Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed not because it was weak, but because it forgot to be wise.